What's up, everybody? How you doing? I'm Dr. B, and welcome to the Force Therapeutic Podcast with one of your hosts, which is me. The other host is
Dr. LaKeith.
And before we get into it, we ask that you like, comment, share, and subscribe and check in because we're going to have more beautiful topics going on and on the way. So, I'm actually really happy to talk about today's topic because this is a topic that me and my brother are passionate about. But I actually text him and said, I want to talk about a topic you are very passionate about because the social worker in him, he's way more knowledgeable on this topic than I am as far as articulating it and sharing it. Little self-disclosure about me. I kind of stepped away from the topic because I'm so engrossed in the brain and how it impacts mental health and how the mind can be used as a tool to help the brain and vice versa. But my younger brother, today's topic is racism and mental health. Yes, that's what we're getting into today. So don't be surprised if Keith is taking more of the reins on this one because he is well versed in it. I'm happy to let him do it. And we're going to start right here with Keith. How do you feel about this topic, little brother?
I'm very passionate about this topic for the simple fact that when you're talking about, now focusing on America, when you're talking about America and we're talking about almost anything, services, healthcare, you have to talk about race.
Yes, I would agree. It's literally interwoven into the fabric of it all. Like there's no part of this history where racism did not, the history of this country where racism did not come into play.
It is America's unique caste system that is very, very American in the way that we deal with it, the way that we talk about it, the history of it, the complexities of it, the nuances of it, and even to a certain extent, the mutation of it. Even today, right, where in times past, it was okay just to be like, overtly racist and just kind of overtly practice racist things. Now, the thing about racism, because we've developed a certain level of awareness and, dare I say, consciousness about racism, people sometimes have this idea that, like, well, it's gone away or it's going away, which one could argue maybe it is starting to shift and actually start to go away. But
do you think that?
No, I don't.
I don't either.
But I will listen to people's argument when they say that. As in, I think that sometimes people kind of conflate two things. One, as in us evolving and becoming less racist.
Okay.
With like, oh, this must mean that racism is coming to an end, or even in some people's minds, it's over. And the reality situation,
people think it's over.
Okay, so here's the thing: we started having these conversations about
that is wild
yes.
to me. You about to say post-Reconstruction?
Not even the post-Reconstruction. I was gonna say we had this kind of conversations about a post-racial America because we got caught up in the euphoria of a black president and a black first lady and beautiful black children who would grow up in the White House, that for a lot of people it kind of symbolized, and understandably so but also wrongfully so, that we're finally in a place now where we can lay racism to rest. It can be RIP because look at what we did. Look what we did as a collective. Like the majority of the country had to vote for this family, for this man, because I say family because don't get it twisted. Michelle and them daughters played a big part in Barack and elected, but this beautiful black family, the majority of this country voted for them. So that means in some way, symbolically, socially, that means that the tide is starting to change and that we're going to enter into this space of anything is possible regardless of race, color, and that, doors are going to open.
No, I can see why you said like people got romanticized by that because my memory of that experience was it kind of exposed the quiet parts a little bit because then we started hearing how they were attacking him, his family,
death threats,
his wife, death threats, things like that. And I agree with you that a conversation does need to be had more around it because post Barack Obama, we then entered into an era, of a Trump era where there are now overt racist activity going on.
It's funny that you say that because when I say this to people, they always go like...
Not saying that the overt racism didn't happen during Barack Obama's administration, but I'm saying that there's a clear increase in the overt actions of racism. Like, just look at Twitter becoming X. When Elon Musk got rid of the hate speech thing, literally, I don't remember what the statistic was, but the use of the N-word among non-black people skyrocketed.
Of course.
Yeah.
So it's funny that you mentioned that, because two things. One, you're right. People, when Barack Obama got elected, had that nostalgia. Not that nostalgia, I'm sorry, that euphoria. But as we worked our way through that presidency, and regardless of how you feel about Barack Obama's effectiveness as a president, policy, all that, it's still the fact that we saw some things that we had not seen before. Like, for instance, we started seeing like these really weird critiques of like Michelle, as in like, well, why is she always wearing like sleeveless dresses? And it's like, no one ever gave too much critique about what Jackie Onassis, Jackie Kennedy at the time, was wearing, Barbara Bush, Nancy Reagan. If anything, was just more so a case of like, oh, they look sophisticated, look elegant. But it was a case of, well, why she always have her arms out? And then it becomes a situation also where like that magazine cover where they portrayed Barack Obama as a terrorist, and they gave Michelle this image of like being a co-conspirator with a bush and the afro, right? And so we start kind of seeing these things. It was kind of like, you couldn't quite put your finger on it unless, and this is just my opinion, unless you're in the black community, where you're like, that's racist. But then when it was being called out, a lot of people in different positions, particularly politicians, say like, well, no, that's just race. That's not racist. That's just it has nothing to do with race. It's just a simple critique that anybody else would get, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Problem is that historically, and even to this day, that's not true. And that's the thing where I say, like, now it has mutated. It's mutated in this space in this weird way where it's a situation where racism happens, but people don't want to believe that it's happening, or they convince themselves that it's not happening, or it happens and people try to give it another justification as to why it's happening.
No, I can agree with that, because I've often talked to my students when I teach them, and we talk about racism. It's an interesting topic, because one thing that tends to come up is I wish things were different, but I understand why in the human mind change is incremental, because too much change too soon can cause dissonance to the system. And I'm going to make a little bit more sense with what I'm saying. What I'm saying is this, is because I know that might have sounded like a word salad. The reason why I think that a lot of people remix the intention of a racist act is because we're asking you to objectively look at this action and call it what it is, as a bad thing.
Yes.
Like I'm asking you to look at what this policy means, what this police officer action means, what this behavior means, whether it's in the medical field, because there's a lot of racism that black people experience in the medical field. There's a lot of racism, as we very know historically, that black people deal with when it comes to the criminal justice system and things of that. Education-wise, we're asking people to objectively look at this and say, is that not racism happening in this institution? And that's a hard pill for even the most well-intentioned white person to swallow. Like, I can see where you're going, but is it though? Because it's kind of like the notion of groupthink kind of activates in that person in that moment, because those people look like me. Are you saying I'm like that? Because I'm not. So that's why I don't know if what you're seeing is what you're seeing.
I'm so glad you said that, because that speaks to racism in the context of mental health, because by that what I mean is this. And Toni Morrison said so eloquently, she said that racism not only has a deleterious effect or diabolical effect on black people, but just as equally, it has a very deleterious and diabolical effect on white people.
Yeah, it's messaging.
Exactly. So it's one of those situations where I think that when you present racism, it has a mental health impact, an adverse mental health impact on both sides. It's just that it looks different because, let's be honest, when we're talking about racism, we're talking about power, right?
Correct.
It just looks different for one side.
Wish more people knew that.
Yeah, because so number one,
thank you, Keith.
A very unpopular opinion, and the thing that most people need to know
Go right ahead.
is that Racism is the result of capitalism, and we have to acknowledge that. In other words, economics. Racism, the system that we have now that started with chattel slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, that was the result of finances. When these United States, not just talking about, let me rephrase that, in these Americas, because I want to be very inclusive of South America and North America, was discovered, it was already understood that these lands must be cultivated, must be made to whatever it need to be made. And Europe at that time had this understanding that, well, we can't enslave other Christians. Particularly the Portuguese were the ones who started this whole thing of slavery and transatlantic slave trade. They had this understanding that as Christians, we can't enslave other Christians. So who does that leave? That leaves people in other parts of the world that we know have a different culture, a different identity, has a different things. And to justify putting anyone in bondage, you have to take their humanity away from them. And one way that you start is like, well, technically they're not Christian. And look how they live. It's so primitive and it's so barbaric. We need to civilize them. And we need to civilize them through the act of servitude. And that, my friends, is how the justification of slavery came into play. It was people convincing themselves that they were doing the right thing, but more so doing it because the fact that there was economic benefits to come and get people to perform free labors, to cultivate a land, to grow crops, to make millions upon millions of dollars for these European countries. And then once America became its own independent country, making millions and millions of dollars for America.
And I'm glad you said that, because I think that, and going back to the original question here in a second about messaging, I think it's important to give things proper terminology and language. So, like, for instance, to my understanding, racism, when we say it is a system thing, we're saying that it is a byproduct of that system being empowered by this action. So laws, cultures, norms. That's why we hear a lot of times on like debates and things like that. You show me where racism is manifesting, and give me that instance where it's an actual institution, even though there's research that shows that. So racism in and of itself is a byproduct of power that you can find in a system influencing a group of people. Prejudice, there we go. Prejudice is a biased mindset that you might have for a group of people. And then discrimination is the act of your prejudice mindset. So when a large group of people in power do a discriminatory act, you can argue that is racism, because they have the power to influence and change the culture.
And specifically systemic racism.
Systemic racism.
Institutional
That's right.
and systemic racism.
So I understand that we use the terms interchangeably, right? Like somebody would be like, you know, Black people have a racist mindset against white people. Asians have a racist, Chinese have a racist mindset against, are racist against Black people. I get that we use it interchangeably, but I also just want to kind of advocate for the people that go, well, that's not racism, that's prejudice, or that's not racism, that's discrimination.
Exactly.
I just want to say that that is the difference. That just because if you decide to only hire a bunch of Black people in your Black business, that's you being discriminatory.
Yeah.
That's not really you being racist in the sense of power, because you don't have the capability to change the trajectory of an entire culture, nation, or group of people.
But what is racist is when you can go into a school district, rewrite policy that says, well, we don't want to talk about slavery because we don't want to make a certain population feel bad or guilty, and completely negate the history of the other population that participate and attend that school, because it's a case of, well, we don't want them to feel guilty because of something that happened years and years ago, which that in itself is racism. But also the mindset that gets you into that place to a certain extent is, I suspect, in my opinion, an unconscious prejudice, because the thing that Brother Ibrahim X mentioned, when we start seeing all these different regulations and bans on different books, but also particularly how we discuss the history of racism in America, is he mentioned something very interesting, very simple. He says, it perplexes me that no one would think that these white children would not identify with the abolitionists, because they're a big part of this conversation when we're talking about how slavery ended in these United States of America.
Right. And his book, Stamped from the Beginning, is actually very, very good. I think they made it. Didn't they make it?
It's a great book, and it's a great documentary on Netflix. Please check it out.
Yeah, that made it into a documentary. I read the book. The book was really, really good. And he's right. Like, it's telling, isn't it? It's like, you think that if we talk about this, the kids are going to identify with the slave owner and not the abolitionist. That's kind of telling in and of itself, which is, I think, is a good segue back to what we were talking about with messaging, like how racism has an effect on both the perpetrator and the person being the victim of said action. Because I can honestly say that people as a whole underestimate the power of messaging to your subconscious or your implicit thinking. Like, when Black people see injustices happening in the news, that then becomes encoded into our fight or flight system, into our brain waves, to where now that when we find ourselves in a similar situation as the person who received the injustice, we are now on alert. Like the traffic stop situation. I think it was it Sandra Bullock?
Sandra Bland.
Not Sandra Bland. No, not her. Not her. God rest her soul. The famous white actress that had a black. I think it is Sandra Bullock.
It's Sandra Bullock.
That she didn't realize what, I'm paraphrasing it, but she had to have the talk with her son or her child about what to do when you
her
get
son Louis.
Her
Why
son,
I remember that, I don't know.
No, I appreciate it, because the more context, the more accurate, the better.
Yeah.
She had to have that conversation with her son Louis, like, about when you get pulled over, this is what you have to do because they're going to treat you differently. To Black people, we know that, but that's a trauma response. That's a response rooted in survival via a racist traffic stop. I'm not saying all cops are going to kill us, but statistically and historically, the interaction between law enforcement and the Black community has not been positive. And that message gets encoded into our brains, into our amygdala, into our hippocampus. So when we get pulled over, when a situation occurs, our fight or flight system is activated. It's tapped in.
Which is why racism has to be discussed in the context of mental health, because racism is a trauma.
Correct.
It is a trauma, particularly within, not even just in the Black community, with our Asian Pacific Islander brothers and sisters, with our Latinx brothers and sisters. It is a trauma that has shaped how we view ourselves in this culture and how we view even each other in this culture, because of, one, the historical context of it, and then two, the policies behind it, and then three, how years and years of that history and then those policies have shaped generations to whereas like, even to this day, I don't care who you are, if you are a person of color that has grown up in the United States of America, you end up at some point with a child in your life who looks just like you or same shade as you, having a conversation about the realities of what they're going to experience and what it is that they're going to see, and that they may possibly or more than likely enter certain spaces where it's going to be very intense. And sometimes intense, when I say that, it doesn't have to be the most obvious. I ran into someone who is a part of the Ku Klux Klan or a neo-Nazi and they just threw racist epithets at me. No. Sometimes it's just something as simple as...
The microaggression from your teacher?
The microaggression from your teacher. Or my personal favorite,
boss.
when you are Black or Latinx and you're in the AP class and it's only you and maybe one other person of color and everybody else may be white. Or if you find yourself in a field, like for instance, our field, if you go to like our natural, I don't know about anyone else, but for our National Convention of Social Workers, it'd be a situation where like you can see a lot of white people.
White women in particular.
White women in particular. And that's not an indictment of the organization. That's not an indictment of anybody, but it is a reality that you have to prepare your kids for, as in you're going to set in certain places, certain spaces, certain fields, certain industries, when you walk into the room, it's going to hit you, I'm the only Black person, or there's only two other Black people here. To where as though that's not going to be the experience for most white people.
Right. So then, little brother, I think that's another segue. What would you say to people that, like in that example, you said you won't find a lot of Black people in certain spaces. Then what would a response be to when people say, but what about the Black community holding itself accountable for not, promoting those spaces to the Black community? You're like me and you, we're two doctors, right? Yeah. How we did it, God given, who knows, right? But you don't see in the Black community the promotion of being smart, being doing STEM, doing research, the things that we need to do,
Yeah.
like people would say, you see us promoting like, rap, entertainment, things of that nature, right?
Yeah.
So what would your response be to somebody that's like, what about that level of accountability that the black community has to have for itself?
My response to that is this. One, that's not true for the simple fact that we do have STEM programs that get promoted. We do have extracurricular activities that go beyond just entertainment and sports that get promoted. There's a lot of things that exist. Now, the real question becomes, how come those things don't get promoted in the way that, and let's be honest, not even just with black people, because I love when people try to say like, well, what about the black, you mentioned black people taking accountability for themselves.
Go ahead.
It's like, first off, we do. I don't know why people don't seem to think that black people don't.
I was actually going to
That's
say,
really weird when people say that to me. It just irks me because it's like, what makes you think that we're not? Oh, because you guys are just trying to blame the system. It's like, it's not a case of blaming the system. It's just the fact that there's data and there's history, written history, that says that plays a part in what's happening now. Like, for instance, that whole conversation about, well, especially when we get into this whole police stuff about the bootstrap thing, which is a whole myth in the United States of America. That's a whole nother conversation. Well, black people have been free from slavery for 250 years, and desegregation has now been almost 60 years. How long is it going to take for you to get yourselves back up or get yourselves in a place in our economic spirit to where so you can stop complaining about being marginalized and left behind? And my thing is, when people say that, they answer the question with their statement, as in, so let me get this straight. You've acknowledged that slavery ended 250 years ago, but also acknowledge the fact that it's expanded for over 200 years. And then you also acknowledge the fact that desegregation to an extent, technically 60 years ago is Brown versus Board of Education, but even still, it took another couple of years into the Civil Rights Act to where it actually happened. So now you're trying to compare, I'll be kind, if we're talking maybe, I'll even give them 1955. I won't even mention 1963. So now you're trying to compare 60 years of possibly getting everything that we need, which we know we have not, to the 200 plus years prior of just being oppressed, abused, traumatized, and held back.
Gotcha.
That is a very bizarre thing to me, to think that, okay, well, within 60 years, we've made all these advancements. You should be. It's like, that's not how that works. That's not how time works. That's not how institutions work. That's not how systems work. Systems change over an extended, and I'm talking maybe even centuries of time. Look from what we got. Look from where we transitioned from the Declaration of Independence to where we are now. As far as like when we're talking about equality and we're talking about equal rights, that did not just happen in 60 years. That happened over the course of over 200 years of history, 300 years of history in America.
Okay. So then, from your opinion, how does racism, because I talked about how it impacts the brain and the mind, right?
Yeah.
Like, for instance, the traffic stop example I gave. What impact does racism have on mental health?
So one, racism, as I always like to say, it is trauma.
Yeah, I would agree.
It is a situation where you find yourself maybe hypervigilant when you go to certain spaces, right? It is a situation where you maybe find yourself anxious in certain spaces where it's just kind of like, okay, so I'm going to be the only black person, black man, black woman in this cohort, in this doctoral program, in this job. And it doesn't even have to be in higher education. It could be a situation, okay, so I'm the only black mechanic, or I'm the only black sanitation worker. I'm the only black person driving the school bus in the school district. It's having to prepare yourself for that, because the fact that because it's the thing we don't do well in America, we don't want to acknowledge the fact that it's I don't say it's difficult. We have a problem when we interact with cultures that are different from us. And sometimes those interactions, they're not bad because we intend them to be bad, but they're bad because of the simple fact that, one, we try to surmise based off of what it is that we know or what it is that we grew up with about what someone else's culture is or what we think it's supposed to be. And those create a very intense and very, very difficult space for people of color.
Gotcha.
As in, it's like, okay, for instance, put you this way, and we're talking in modern times. Why do we need the Crown Act?
Go over the Crown Act.
So the Crown Act, so particularly in Texas and some other states have gotten written in law, they have to put in law that it is against state law to discriminate against someone based off of their hair texture and hairstyle.
Yep.
Right? As in, we interact with somebody that has a different hairstyle, hair texture from us, and we automatically assume, well, they're not professional, or that's not professional. Right. How? We don't know that they're not professional until they show up and they're unprofessional.
Right. And I think that is the byproduct, going back again to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, is that messaging.
Yeah.
How did a style of hair become associated with unprofessional, deviant, criminal? Because something that you said earlier, right? How do you justify the action of how you treat people the way you do? Dr. Amos Wilson, may he rest in peace, a famous psychologist, he wrote a really good book called The Criminalization of the African American, I believe it's called. But it's actually a really, really good book where he talks about, from a psychological standpoint, the only way you can justify treating people that way is that you have to look at them differently than what they are.
The othering of other people.
Correct. You have to look at them as deviant and as deserving. That's the overall view of the book. He goes into it in great detail. But I do think that that's a byproduct in the example of the Crown Act. Why do you have it? To be able to protect black people. Yeah. Why do we have to have that in place to protect black people? Because somewhere in the history of things, locks, cornrows, that hairstyle has been associated with all these negative things. Yeah. And it's what you're saying, like, how do you know that this person is unprofessional? How do you know these things? Basically, what I'm getting at is this is another extension of the systemic part of racism. How are we informed that X is good, Y is bad? It's built into our culture. It's built in there. This is good, this is bad. I'll never forget the movie scene with Denzel, and I don't know the name of the movie, but it was a viral clip. The judge asked Denzel's character, why are your people so bent on being associated with the color black? He said, why are your people so bent on being associated with the color white?
That's not, that was Malcolm X.
No, it wasn't Malcolm X. No. That I would never.
Okay, fair.
I would never do that to Brother Malcolm. But no, but the context of it is, think about it. When I say the color black, think of all the adjectives that you have that go with the color black, right? Yeah. And then when I say the color white, think of all the adjectives that go with white. Now that is in the Malcolm X scene where he was in prison and he looked it up and he was like, But that's what I'm getting at. It's the messaging influences our way of life. So when I say it influences our way of life, this is what I mean. People take for granted how much your culture influences how you look at the world and how your body and your brain reacts to it. When I know that this is the rule and this is the standard, even though I don't match that rule or standard, I proceed cautiously in a state of anxiety to make sure I don't draw attention to myself. What I'm saying is what my younger brother's saying about being black or being brown or being non-white in white spaces. I got to proceed with a level of hypervigilance and policing myself when all I'm doing is just being. But I got to police my speech, police my style of dress. I truly do appreciate my clients, because one thing I was going to say was racism in and of itself, to all those other things when it comes to mental health, it is a stress multiplier.
It is.
Because there's already a stressful work environment, a stressful economy. So when I say I appreciate my clients, a lot of my clients now, given the economy, they're tired of their jobs. They're sick of their jobs because they're not making enough money in order to live in this area we live in. But also, on top of the stress of just that, they have to navigate that space as a black man, black woman, black whatever you identify with. That's on top of the already stressful environment that we're in. So research shows that it is actually a huge stress multiplier that can make certain mental health issues, and I'm not just talking about disorders, I'm talking about issues, worse. And I think that we are underestimating, in my professional opinion, the power of messaging when it comes to how racism impacts those people who are victims of it.
Definitely, because here's one thing I know you're very passionate and knowledgeable on, because that messaging gets even so to us as clinicians in our upbringing, in our personal lives, that in turn, whether we are conscious of it or not, shows up in how we interact or even diagnose clients.
Right.
And sometimes how, as black people, when we are assessed and get diagnosis were oftentimes
Misdiagnosed on the extreme end.
because
Black
there's
people,
a cultural bias.
it is a
in it.
cultural bias. Black people are really likely to be misdiagnosed when it's cross racially, 1,000%. And shockingly, I have to go back and get the research on it because it was in my dissertation. It tends to be sometimes on the extreme end of what we would call a psychosis, which is an extreme mental health disorder.
That's
but
schizophrenia.
right, exactly. Black people are often misdiagnosed because of cultural perception. You find it everywhere. Just even just Black women's testimonies about when they go to medical doctors and try to get help with different things. I think that right there is telling of itself of how like people don't even feel safe trying to go to their primary care doctor sometimes because they're worried about what type of response they may get.
Serena Williams had to save her own life after she gave birth. She
remember
felt
that,
in
yes.
her body something is wrong, and they just tried to tell her, no, this is normal, you're okay. And she had to be insistent just for them to do what they need to do to tell her, oh my God, you had a blood clot, and had we not caught it, it would have killed you.
Yes.
And
Things
then,
like that.
and then when that came out, I can never forget it. When that came out, the stories that Black women shared about their experiences as far as like not being hurt, and also ties into the reason why we have like this very odd high infant mortality rate with black babies, but also maternal rate, high maternal rate in regards to moms just delivering, because when examining that, it was a case of doctors for some reason either had this perception that Black women had a higher tolerance of pain,
Right.
or the perception of like they're just being, for lack of a better term, overly dramatic.
Right.
And
No, you're right, because you also hear in like in the medical field that Black people are kind of aware of that. So we're so conditioned to no one listening to our cries that we kind of like, we don't manifest it the same way.
yes,
Like it doesn't present the same way. It could be a real bad situation where we're like, I don't want to be an inconvenience to you. I'm fine. Things like
Yeah.
that, right? Because I don't want to upset you. Whatever the bare minimum is, I'll take it. But then on the flip side, when we are loud, boisterous, it's like, you're making a scene. It's not that serious.
we'll call the security.
We'll call security. Lo and behold, it was that serious. I was in a great deal of pain. But for me, that does, not making it the word of the day, it does go back to cultural messaging.
Yes, no, it's the truth.
And people are not aware of how it activates or it operates, I should say, at a subconscious and unconscious level.
No, you're 1,000% correct, and that's what I mean when it says it has just as much of a bad effect on white people as it does communities of color. Because when you said that, it made me, it just, all these images of, and this speaks to the trauma, I think, to all of us, particularly as Black people, of Black men, even if they had committed a crime, being detained and being told, I can't breathe, or a situation where like, I need my medication, something's wrong, and then the police or powers that be having this perception of, oh, well, Black men in this particular setting, they're just doing that to get out, or they're just doing that to do whatever, just for them to die.
Yeah. And when I say to that example, you're right, because when I say that it operates at a subconscious, unconscious level, I don't think people understand is like, we are driven by our bodily responses.
Yeah.
So when I interact with another person, and in my mind, I have a script on how that should go.
Yeah.
Right. And if it starts to deviate from that script, my body's going to react. I'm going to activate some part of my body. So therefore, when I say that we operate according to this way, there is a messaging that when Black people interact with non-Black people, or let's say white people in different spaces, I have an idea of how this is supposed to go at a subconscious level, and so do you.
Yeah.
And when it deviates, your autonomic nervous system, your fight or flight system turns on, and so does mine.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's turning on in response to me deviating from what you perceive to be the norm. And I'm using that as a loose example because how many times have we heard where it's like, think about this for those people watching. This is an example. You know, I've been listening to the other coworkers and they say like, they just can't read you. Like, you don't seem to be talkative to them. You're not getting along.
Yeah.
And what do we hear in response sometimes? I'm just here to do my job. Why I got to be friends with everybody?
That part.
Exactly. There is an expectation here. I'm trying to read you. I'm trying to read to see if you're a threat or not. Are you aggressive or hostile? I'm speculating right now. I don't have any anecdote. I don't have any research for that, but it's kind of like, what are you reading me for?
Yeah.
Why can't I just show up, clock in, do my job? I'm not here to make friends with everybody at work. I am friendly. I am cordial. Why do I have to do what you want me to do? Why do I have to be the way you want me to be? And because I'm not, now you're sizing me up and analyzing me. You're getting triggered and it's triggering me. So now all of a sudden where I'm just coming to work doing my job, I'm a bad employee because I don't want to be friends and go to happy hour with y'all. I don't want to hang around a water cooler and talk shop with you. We don't even like the same things. We don't like the same people. You like Taylor Swift. That person likes Megan Thee Stallion. Sure, there might be some songs that can cross and intersect, but I don't want to talk about that with you. I'm just here to do my job. And that's what I mean when I say that we are not aware of how messaging activates our responses to things.
Well, that's what I mean when it says like how racism has mutated in the sense of now it's gotten to this place where like it's just so insidious that and I say this very intentionally, we all participate in it without realizing we participate in it. By that, what I mean is this: white people participating in it by holding views that they don't fully understand as being racist or biased. As in like, well, no, I didn't mean any harm by it. And I believe that most don't. But it's also a case of the fact that just because you mean harm by it, does not mean that that viewpoint is not rooted in some sort of bias or some sort of racism. And even to a certain extent, and this is a black person, I guess, holding his blackness accountable, even me recognizing it myself, sometimes participating in racism. And finding myself in certain settings or certain places where one could argue, well, that doesn't seem racist, that seems classist. But I also recognize that maybe sometimes my classism may be rooted in racism. As in how many times, and y'all can take me to task on it in the comments, I don't mind, I'm human. How many times not saying you specifically, just broadly, those of us who are black, we go to certain places and say like, this feel a little ghetto. It's like, this is ghetto. Like, it's like, oh my God, like look, they got the bass booming.
Hey, Keith, I do that all the time.
Exactly. I just came here to get my crab boil, and y'all don't even have the clean version of the song. But we participate in that because reality situation.
Because we black though.
Because the reality situation is this. We turn it into a thing about race when really it's more so a thing about class. Because my thing is this. I'm pretty confident that there are white bars that play rock and roll music with not so clean lyrics that have people kind of dancing very provocatively and suggestively.
Yeah.
But instead of just turning it into a class thing, we turn it into an assault on ourselves and our culture.
Right. And I agree. You're right. That's a perfect example of messaging on the other side. Like Dr. Cress Wessling said it best, that racism is interwoven into the fabric of our reality. It really is, to where we're going to participate in it even when we're not aware of it. Like, the light skin, dark skin, light skin versus dark skin thing.
Colorism.
Like color doing the devil's work.
It is.
Like, what?
But see, that's the power of racism. Racism is the best fiction, non-fiction man ever created. See, that is the power of racism. Racism is the best fiction, non-fiction that America, its particular brand, has ever created. By that, what I mean is this. We know that now at this point, it is a social construct. It is not really rooted in anything scientific, just visuals based off of what it is that we can see, certain physical attributes, particularly being melanin skin color. But it's non-fiction in the fact that the practice, the culture, the ritual, the institutions, the policies written around it have shaped the lives of people in ways that sometimes that they normalize, that they forget. They completely forget that, wait, my perception of another black person because they are of a different complexion, that has nothing to do with anything scientific, anything real, as in like, oh, light skins and dark skins are totally different or whatever. It's only real because we've engaged in the practice of colorism that puts one up here and one down here. And as a result has created centuries of kind of sparring and us attributing certain attributes to one or the other based off of not even anything actual per se, but more so based off of like experiences that have been structured a certain type of way to make us believe that like, oh, well, light-skinned people are better or dark-skinned people are stronger.
No, and you're right. Like we did not, or we do not recognize that. Going back to what you said, we're engaging in it. Yeah. Even if it is in a joking way, right? But we're still engaging in it. But that's how ingrained that it is.
It's into our psyche, into our mental health.
Into our actual psyche, into our mental health. We're so ingrained into it that we make jokes around it and joke about it.
And the only time, and I love when I meet any of our brothers and sisters from Africa, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, Senegal, when they come to the United States and they have conversations or witness this whole thing that is racism, it is very perplexing to them because, for one, most people from Africa, when they come here, they don't view themselves as black, not in the way that...
Not African American.
Not African American, or this whole caste system, because when you grow up in a country that is 90% black, it's just a case of, okay, there's no such thing as like, okay, race in that regard. Maybe differences based off of ethnic groups, ethnicity, definitely. But when you hear them speak and they get exposed to it, they're able to articulate in a way I don't think anyone else can. To where so they can say like, no, I know that's like to actually grow up in a very homogenous environment where it's like we're just.
What does homogenous mean, little
I'm sorry, homogenous in the sense of we all consist of the same identity, the same culture, and in the context of race, the same skin color, right? And so when they come and they articulate it, it's just so refreshing, and they're able, in my opinion, to articulate in a way to white people that I don't think that they fully understand. And they're able to articulate to us in ways that I know we know, but sometimes we forget. As in just the way that they say like, no, I came from a space where like just black is black, as in like I don't think of it in the context of a race. It's just the fact that I have the skin color that I have. And then they articulate what that's like. And then they articulate when they come to America and they have like that first interaction with either like a microaggression or just really just outright racism. They're able to kind of draw a line and say, this is what racism is in the modern time. Right? And so it's just this, like I said, racism American style, because I don't want to negate racism existing throughout the rest of the world, is such a piece of work that even to this day, we're still trying to fully understand it. Because I think we just scratched the surface of it.
Yeah, because it's a form of a survival thrust. Yeah. I'm going to quote Dr. Kobe Kimbone. I forgot, he changed his name to that too. I used to know his last name's Baldwin. It was Dr. Baldwin, but I can't remember what it was before that. But he viewed it under the lens of it's a survival thrust. White people who practice and engage in it, it's a way of making sure that your ethnic group survives and goes forward. Black people have a black survival thrust. The issue is, like you were saying, racism in America, American racism is unique because it has a unique history of chattel slavery and everything that comes with it. But also we have our own survival thrust, but it's encapsulated in the survival thrust of a white culture. Yes. So therefore, we're trying to find ways of making who we are fit in the grand scheme of a culture that viewed us as always deviant or less than. So I could see why, like, how an African person from Africa come to America and be like, this is a little bit different. But I would imagine that given the history of that continent and external influences from other nations, they have their own flavor that they deal with as well. Because when you had said that earlier, it made me think about when, remember the movie Blood Diamond?
Yes.
I forget the black actor's name.
Jaimin Hunsu.
Thank you so much, because I was going to butcher it. He, in the behind the scenes scene, there's a line in that movie where he said that what really touched him and shook him to his core was when Leonardo DiCaprio's character said, "Without me, you're just another black man in Africa." And he was like, it shook him to his core because, like, there's some truth in that you realize, I'm assuming, as an African person. Yeah. So it's everywhere. That's why I like, to quote Mark, white supremacy is a global. This is how I look at it,
Yeah.
everybody. I want y'all to know this is how I look at it. White supremacy is a global thing. Then you have pockets of racism in different nations. That's why, like, you have American racism. You probably have United States of America
yeah.
racism. Then you probably have Canadian racism.
yeah.
Then you probably have British racism.
Yeah.
But then you still live in a global system of white
yeah.
supremacy.
We call it different things, but and to Mark's point, Mark's 100% correct, because in historical circles and academic circles, we call it colonialism.
You know what? I want to make this a real producer. You know what, Mark? We would love for you to come on. I'm going to make sure Keith tags you. Come on down and we'll come up. He in Philly, right?
Yeah, Mark is several different places.
All right, Mark. We would love to have you on, talk about this topic a little bit more in depth. Because who better to talk about it than you, right? So I would think that that'd be a good idea to have him on to talk about it since we just quoted him. But
and Mark Lamont Hill, ladies and gentlemen.
yeah, we were going to tag him anyway. I was. I looked over at your camera like you can see. I was going to tag you, Mark. I'm going to tag Mark, Dr. Mark Lamont Hill. I'm going to tag you. And I'm going to say, you got a response? Hopefully he answered if he ain't too busy.
All I got to say is Mark is, well, I know Mark. I love Mark, but yeah.
But why did, so in light of all of that, what we talked about racism, how it literally is encoded into us, how we even participate in it and we don't even realize it, right? Because I was, not to get long-winded, thinking about the colorism conversation, it made me think about when Alicia Keys and India Arie were out at the same time. I was like, man, that's crazy. Because it made me think back to like when they first came out, they kept comparing the two and everything. And they're literally two different genres of music, right? Yeah. But why, now that we've talked about all that, how it's encoded, how it's a stress multiplier, how it affects the way we interact with one another. So in light of everything that we talked about, do you think that this is why Black clinicians are important?
1,000,000%. Not even 100. 1 million.
All right, fair enough. Well, all right, everybody, that wraps up today's episode. If you made it this far in the video, we appreciate you. Even if you didn't, we still appreciate you. All we ask is that you like, comment, subscribe, and share. And tune in next time for another episode of Force Therapeutic Podcast. Take care and be safe.